that it's the political culture in which a party operates that's quite often determines what goes on within the party. One of the things that the EHRC inquiry into the Labour Party found is that this was not a problem of anti-Semitism in the formal rules and policies. This was a problem of anti-Semitism in the political culture that took hold in the Labour Party, which is exactly how institutional racism operates. And this political culture was shaped by people inside the party, but also by people outside the party. Because in the secret Facebook groups and the Twitter networks where these people all join together and where the discourse and the ideas and the culture is set, it doesn't matter whether you're actually a formal member of the Labour Party or not. And some of the most influential voices on the left influencing ideas in the Labour Party under Corbyn were not actually members of the party. So it's not enough just to police what's going on in the party in a formal way. It has to be, you have to be looking at the broader political culture. The other thing we realized is people who have never thought about Jews or Israel or anti-Semitism before will adopt anti-Semitic ideas and positions if that's what they need to do to defend their broader politics. Right, one of the biggest battles we had in the Labour Party was over Ken Livingstone, who was a former mayor of London, because he took it on himself to promote the idea that the Zionist movement collaborated with Nazi Germany in the 1930s and even into the 1940s. And one of his main arguments for this was the Haravat Agreement, which was an agreement to help German Jews leave Germany for Mandate Palestine in the 1930s. Now, we don't need to go into the details of all of that, except to know that literally we had a situation where the rights and wrongs of the Haravat Agreement was a subject of debate in local Labour Party meetings in branches up and down the country where no one knew anything about it until Ken Livingstone opened his mouth. There were no Jewish people there. There were no Palestinians or Israelis in these CLP meetings. But this became the thing that everyone adopted their political battle lines according to, depending on whether Ken Livingstone was in your political faction or an opponent. And that's how anti-Semitism spread. There were a few lessons for the Jewish community as well. One of them is we had to respond in a way that we've never had to respond to before with a mainstream political party, dealing with anti-Semitism within the party in this way. And British Jews, I have to say, became much more American in the last few years. What do I mean by that? Much more outspoken, much more assertive, much more publicly assertive of Jewish identity in a political sense, which has not traditionally been the British way. And I have to say, the thing that really, really mattered, being unified, and actually within the Jewish community, not treating it as a partisan issue, even though it did become very party political. Easier said than done, I know, but that was a really important part of the response. And the last thing that we learned, and I'll stop here because I know we're limited to time. We learned to kind of pick our battles. What are the really, really fundamental, important things to stand firm on and say, we will not let this pass? And really being focused on, why did it matter for the Jewish community that the Labour Party had a leadership that was not only not really sympathetic or empathetic to the Jewish community, but was encouraging a culture and a type of politics that was actively hostile? In practical terms, why did it matter? People talked about an existential threat to Jewish life. What does that actually mean in real terms? And how do we convey that to a broader public, most of whom in Britain don't know any Jewish people and don't even know what the word anti-Semitism means? So what's the language that we have to use to convey these key points, the things that really matter to us? And then afterwards, finally, how do we heal the wounds? Because it was an incredibly bruising period for the Jewish community. How do we heal the wounds and how do we move on? Now we're in a kind of post-Corbyn phase. I could talk for hours about this, but I'll stop at this point because I know we're on a time limit. But thank you.
Thank you very much, Dave. Our next speaker is David Hirsch. David is a senior lecturer in the sociology at Goldsmiths University of London. He's interested in anti-Semitism, right and left populism, totalitarianism, and anti-democratic movements. He's a campaigner against anti-Zionism and its associated anti-Semitism. His book, Law Against Genocide, Cosmopolitan Trials, won the prize for the best first book in sociology in 2003. Thank you very much, David, for your presence here. The floor is yours.
Hi. Well, firstly, echo everything that Dave Richards just said. I want to do something similar, actually, but slightly different. I want to also zoom out and have a look at context. Look at the 21st century, look at the beginning, look at September 2000, January 2001 is the end of the peace process, the beginning of the Second Intifada. September 2001 is Durban, the Durban Conference, which I think is very interesting and significant. It's a kind of attempt, and quite a successful attempt, to go back to the 1970s Zionism is racism paradigm from the thing that people had sort of been believing through the 80s and the 90s, really, which was two states. And Durban was a successful attempt to kind of recreate that. And as we know, with that, at Durban came a kind of wave, an uncontrollable wave of anti-Semitism. And that's a lesson too, is that when we get anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism leaks out from behind it and through it and under it and over it. And with anti-Semitism comes our worries about anti-Semitism and our descriptions of anti-Semitism. And with that comes what I have called the Livingston formulation, which is the standard response to people who raise the issue of anti-Semitism, which is to say, not only do you not really believe that there's anti-Semitism, but we know what you're up to, and what you're really up to is pretending that there's anti-Semitism in order to silence criticism of Israel. And that must have come through Durban, actually, as a kind of symbolically foundational moment of the recreation of the 70s anti-Zionism and the recreation of the anti-Semitism that comes with it. And people wrote about it, called it the new anti-Semitism. And of course, a week later was 9/11. So Durban was a kind of resurgence of political or left-wing anti-Semitism, and 9/11, the resurgence, the reassertion of radical jihadi anti-Semitism. A year later, we get the boycott call, and the boycott call relates very clearly back to Durban, back to the resetting of the narrative to anti-Zionism, and specifically to Israel as apartheid. Israel is apartheid and should be boycotted. We then get in Britain a kind of fight between 2003 and 2005, and for the next 2 or 3 years in the academic trade unions over the proposal for an academic boycott of Israel. And at the time we thought that was important, and people said, why is it important? And we said, because if we lose here in the academic trade unions, and if the campuses allow us to lose in the trade unions, then it will spread. And we were wrong in the sense that we thought we might win, but we were right in the sense of knowing what would happen if we didn't. And in fact, we could not have lost more completely in the academic unions by 2009. And what we feared would happen happened, that the anti-Zionism and the anti-Semitism which comes with it then mainstreamed into the trade union movement. And then there was this kind of weird moment when, for various reasons, it just ballooned into the mainstream. Jeremy Corbyn came to leadership of the Labour Party, and we had 2 general elections in which he might have, he was knocking on the door of number 10 Downing Street. And then, really, because of his defeat in 2019, in the general election, Corbyn was then pushed back and pushed out. And it's quite interesting because if you talk to the politicos in the Labour Party who were fighting the battle in the party, they're quite pleased with themselves. And in a sense, they've got every right to be pleased with themselves. They won the battle against Corbyn in the party. They, kicked him out of leadership. They kicked his supporters out of the big committees. Each local party is sort of one by one kicking out the Corbynites. And the political organisers feel that they did a really good job, and they did. But from my point of view on campus, things are not so good. I think partly because anti-Semitism, I mean, in a sense, it hugely overreached itself by trying to win number 10 Downing Street. It might have done, it didn't. It's now pushed back. The anti-Semites have kind of been leaving the Labour Party largely, but they are reconsolidating on campus in quite a serious way. These are now battle-hardened people who have had a sniff of power and a sniff of success. And the lesson that they've learned is that between us and progress, between us and the good society, sits the Jews. And in particular, between us and progress sits the Jews with their dishonest allegation of anti-Semitism. So it's bigger, it's stronger, it's more consolidated. And we can see that with, it's quite interesting. There were two kind of set piece battles really a few months ago. One was over David Miller, who is the pretty well evidently anti-Semitic professor at Bristol University. And Miller kind of split anti-Zionism. Some of them, he was too much to stomach even for the kind of soft anti-Zionists, and some of them lined up in support of him. On the other hand, the pushback against the IRA working definition didn't split them, it united them in a very big and important way. And as far as I'm concerned, IRA is very simple. IRA is an affirmation that the kind of anti-Semitism which takes the form of hostility to Israel and goes further is real and it's significant. And if an institution adopts IRA, then it affirms that that kind of anti-Semitism exists and is significant, and they kind of promise to take it seriously. But the fight against IRA, to delegitimize IRA, to say that IRA is a Trumpist, Tory, Boris Johnson trick in order to close down free speech on campus, it really resonates, and it did very well. And then during the recent conflict, we saw another escalation, and I think the key escalation we saw then was about what I would call loyalty tests. There were a very, very large number of statements which were put out all over academia and all over campus, which said, you must support BDS, Israel is apartheid. The narrative of two sides is pro-imperialist and Zionist and racist. And believing these three things are foundational to our scholarship and to our personal morality. And by the way, we saw it in the legal profession too, that believing these three things is foundational to my being a lawyer. And in South Africa, of course, we saw it in relation to the ability of a Jewish guy to serve on the Constitutional Court. So that's a kind of escalation. So yes, the structures of the Labour Party have been more or less cleaned out of overt anti-Semites, but the left upon which it is based was in 2015 sufficiently anti-Semitic to allow Jeremy Corbyn to be elected as leader and re-elected as leader. And the underlying ideas and the discourses which appear in terms like decolonization and whiteness and all kinds of ways in which the struggle against Israeli apartheid is put central to the struggle of all good people all over the world. These ideas are consolidating and are important. So we won in the structures of the Labour Party, and that's important. That was a win. But the big issue about what is the common sense of good people in Britain, and of course further afield, in France, in Europe, in the United States, is less encouraging. And of course, the more these ideas dominate the left, dominate on campus, dominate the community of the good, dominate the discourse of decent people, the more it's possible for them to return in quite sudden and strange ways, like they did in 2015 in the British Labour Party.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you. So Jana Greenspoon. Jana is a senior lecturer in language science at Sorbonne Nouvelle University. She's also a member of an academic network, RRA, Research on Racism and Anti-Semitism, and she directs a research group, New Radical Discourses. Thank you, Jana. We are pleased to hear you.
Thank you very much. I was very surprised when I was invited to take part in this panel because, first of all, it's called How to Deal with Political Parties that Promote Antisemitism. Do you know political parties that say we promote antisemitism? No, no political party does. And then when Ruth gave me this task, I said, well, how can we deal with them? It's not my problem. I'm not a politician. I'm a discourse analysis. But that's a task, and so we have to comply with what we say. So I will very briefly show you what is the situation in, it's not a good PowerPoint, I'm sorry, so we have to stop sharing and to open the other one. What's the situation in France with the political parties, because I'm not so sure that everybody knows what happens, but just let me, 1 minute. It's not a good one that has, well, here is the one. Anyone can help with sharing. Sorry. So this one has to be shared. This one, okay. Just
you did?
No, she does. Just a second. This one, yeah.
Okay. Yes.
Now. Okay, here we go. So, speaking about France, there is a little problem that we have because actually French leaders display a contradictory perspective on anti-Semitism. From the one point of view, we all know it's very bad, and all young French people are told that anti-Semitism is not good. Even the parties that actually are anti-Semite, and I will come to that, they say that they are not anti-Semite, they are anti-Zionist. Well, I'll show you the examples right now. On the other hand, we have leftist intellectuals and a very strong and powerful left political discourse that exercise such a heavy critiques on Israel and on Zionism and defines Palestinians as only victims, that actually it cancels the previous message. And we have a real problem with that with young people. So the fight against these forms of anti-Semitism and hatred is not waged through outraged speeches that we all can hold by politicians or academics, but rather through the implementation of a policy of deterrence, as well as firm measures against the all forms of behavior that are contrary to the laws of the Republic. Now I would like to show you what are these parties very quickly, and well, I hope it will work now. So how we move the okay, we don't have
put it as a presentation.
just like here.
And you should extend the presentation.
Here.
Yeah.
Yeah, this one. This one.
Don't have any.
Yes.
Okay. And now, so I won't talk about anti-Zionism because everybody knows that, and that's been 2 days we're speaking about that. I just remind what is the main doxa in France. It's just Zionism equal racism equal colonialism. Everybody knows this discourse by heart. And what happens today in France and in Europe is the fact that anti-Zionism becomes a positive designation in the rhetorical disposition, if you want, in anti-racist and anti-colonialist circles. If you're anti-racist, you have to be anti-Zionist. That's a principle of behavior in France. It's normally the discourse of the radical left and part of the traditional left as well. So we were talking about Zionism and anti-Zionism. I propose here 4 significations briefly in order to go further. The anti-Zionism might imply different things. It's a semantic problem as well. The first one is the opposition to the Zionist project, because if we say anti-communism, it's the opposition to the communist total regime. So in the same way, the anti-Zionism is the opposition to Zionism as an ideology. It might be also the criticism of Israeli policy. We've heard about that. And then it is not anti-Semitic. Well, we don't know where the frontier is. It is also, as we heard yesterday, conspiratorial denunciation of world Zionism, as the World Ipsat showed us. And it also might be the denial of the right to the existence of the State of Israel, which is clearly anti-Semitic. So now, what's going on in the political discourse in France? Well, we'll talk about the profound reasons of that. What are the parties and what are the tendencies in France? It's, of course, the Communist Party. Well, the leader of the Communist Party is Jean Rosa. What he says very often, in many of the discourses we can hear it, is Zionism is a nationalist and colonialist ideology, I quote. And actually, you can find this quotation when you look at the PLO Charter that has never been abolished, and especially Article 22. It's the same discourse. Then we have the Parti des Indigènes de la République, PIR. The leader of this party was Ouria Boutedja. We'll come back to her. We also have RN, Rassemblement National, which is a former Front National, merci beaucoup. Front National. Today, the leader is Marine Le Pen, the daughter of the old Jean-Marie Le Pen. And we also have France Insoumise, which is the left party, the leader of which is Jean-Luc Mélenchon. So this is those parties in certain way promote anti-Semite or anti-Zionist discourses. How they do that? That's why I wanted my PowerPoint to be here to show you the examples. Jean Rosa, for example, took this picture where you recognize the personality of Ahmed Tamimi. And he said then, it was La Fête de l'Humain, it was the holiday of L'Humanité, which is the left-wing journal. She embodies Palestinian resistance. Well, and you probably remember who Ahmed Tamimi is. Now, you also have very often a communist party that condemns Israel in any possible way. Here is the extract that was taken. There's a discourse of the communist leader that was pronounced during the 11 days war with Hamas in May. Israel violates human rights. So no one talked about Israeli children, no one talked about Israeli victims, no one talked about the rockets, but everybody was talking in France about the Palestinian victims and the cruelty of Israel and the violation of the human rights, which is quite a stable expression of the discourse of our left. Now, this is le PIR, Parti des Indigènes de la République. And the leader of this party, well, you see how she's photographed, Ouria Boutedja. They don't have a lot of influence in the political landscape, but they have a huge power in the academia, in the university. And you see her here with the slogan, Zionist to Gulag. And actually, I thought about her when I listened to the message of Natan Sharansky, who spent 9 years in Gulag, and which is here we have the discourse, Stalinist discourse, that was not only popular in the Soviet Union, but that was the condemnation of Zionists, as you all know. And she doesn't have any problem with that. She says Zionism, but actually she means the Jews. She is also the personality who wrote a book that is called White, Jews and Us. And actually she explained that Jews are a sort of subgroup of white people and they're the worst of those who exist in the world. So this is our academia, very important personality. She is invited to some congresses. Now it's a little bit more difficult for her, but she was very popular amongst the students, at least my university. She also said after Mohamed Merah killed Jewish children in Toulouse, Mohamed Merah c'est moi, it's me, Mohamed Merah, it's me. Well, you see the identification with the murderer. So, I mean, this kind of statements don't need any particular comment. So here is probably this is the most anti-Semite and anti-Zionist party that we have. And when she says, Mohamed Merah, it's me, what actually she says? Mohamed Merah, before he was killed, he spoke to the French police, and his discourse, what he said, had been registered. And so we have the French journal Libération that proposed the registration of his discourse. So he explained and legitimated his acts, his killings and his murder of the Jews. Well, I quote, I killed the soldiers in France because in Afghanistan they kill my brothers. I killed Jews in France because the same Jews kill innocent people in Palestine. So I had a precise aim in choosing my victims. Well, this is not the discourse that you can hear only from terrorists or from some Islamic fundamentalism. This is a discourse that is spread by the media that you can hear at the university, and this is a kind of doxa that had nourished 3 generations of French. Now, what about Jean-Luc Mélenchon? He's not, well, probably, he never promoted anti-Semitism, but I think that if the speaker that will speak after me will explain how he spoke about CRI, the Jewish organization. And last year he announced to the France, I don't know if Jesus was on the cross. I know who put him there. It seems those are his own compatriots. So you see, we're speaking about the left. We say they're not anti-Zionist, but this is a clearly anti-Semitic expression. Well, and he actually didn't have any problem with saying that. There are many examples from the media, and the national central media, like Le Monde, might be also Le Figaro. Well, you see Israeli troops, just to show you that it works together with a political discourse. Now, just a title, Israeli troops' methods of mass electronic surveillance. Shin Bet will be able to track location data on infected people's phones without prior authorization from a judge. That happened during Corona, and everybody now has an application to identify Corona, but when it appeared, Israel has been accused to survey the people without their authorization. So any reason is good to bash Israel. In the same article in Le Monde, this boils down to using surveillance methods comparable to those used in the Palestinian territories occupied since 1967 and in the areas under the control of the Palestinian Authority and Hamas and Gaza, but this time within Israel's border. So Israel is a criminal. Now, this is very briefly the examples. I spoke yesterday, but I know you were all present about that, about the official French discourse during the war with the Hamas. Jean-Yves Le Drian, the minister of the Foreign Affairs, thank you very much. He said that Israel is taking the risk of apartheid. So this we know. Jean Castex never talked about the rockets of Hamas, but he talked about the Palestinian victims. So all this goes together, but it's not all. There are many different examples. I won't take too much time, just one of them. On February 22, last year, the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs, quite famous ministry, published a statement that severely reprimanded Israel for freezing funds destined to the Palestinian Authority, appealed to Israel to respect the Oslo agreements, and condemned Israel for the unjust and illegitimate measures. The decision of the Israeli government to freeze part of those funds had been taken after 2 particularly ferocious attacks, where 2 young Israeli girls were murdered by Palestinian terrorists. Mahmoud Abbas then ordered to put the portraits of the murderers in the streets of Ramallah to glorify their murder. Though we also could see their portraits in the suburb where I live, in Champigny, and that was the national feast, actually. Mahmoud Abbas, as you know, rewarded the terrorists. He later pronounced a speech announcing the payment of salaries to all the martyrs and their families, and that the martyrs and their families are sacred. Neither the French media nor the Ministry of Foreign Affairs condemned Abbas for glorifying terrorism. Instead, the indictment was against Israel for its unjust and illegal measures. So we have this kind of overturning and arguments and disinformation all the time. the example that I have given you is the one, and there are many other examples. How to deal with that? This is a problem. So the examples anybody in this room can give plenty of them. Léon Poliakov, who's a prominent French historian and who spent his life to describe, analyze, and understand anti-Semitism, once said, a couple of years before his death, that the anti-Semitism, or he used the word Judeophobia, cannot be fought with rational arguments. However, it's a political, cultural, and civic necessity to be involved in this struggle. Well, this commitment must be affirmed as a correlate to educational initiatives. We all know that education is important. We've been speaking about education all the time. Well, what is our problem? We actually all know in Europe that Israel has lost the psychological war because the Hasbara doesn't work, because there was no information, there are Jews, there are anti-Semites, anti-Zionists, and those who don't know anything about Israel. And Israel doesn't do anything to change the situation. I can't answer the question how we deal with these political parties. We think in France, those who deal with anti-Semitism, that we can't talk with those who believe in anti-Zionism because it's a faith, it's a religious matter. People who believe that Israel doesn't have to exist or that Zionism is a racism, they behave themselves like religious people. And when you say to someone who believes in God, God doesn't exist, you just don't pay attention to. It's the same. So actually, we think that we have to deal with the people. We say that they are goodwill, but badly informed. See, and well, I think this has to be our target. The whole situation in France makes me think about the Aesop fable that had been adopted by La Fontaine. And this is the wolf and the lamb fable, as you all know. Well, probably everybody knows the fable. So there is a moment that the wolf, he wants to eat the lamb, and the lamb told the wolf that he didn't do anything. He's not guilty. And then the wolf wrote, like the trembling lamb, do not be angry. I cannot possibly muddy the water, because the wolf accused him that he muddied the water that he was drinking. I can't possibly muddy the water you are drinking up there. Remember, you are upstream and I am downstream. But the wolf replied that it doesn't matter that before eating the lamb. If it's not him, it was his brother. If it's not his brother, it was his mother. And if it's not his mother, it was his neighbor. Anyway, he was guilty. So you can't deal with that. And our political leaders, whom I quoted, they just think this. So what to do? Probably, I think that we need a very strong Hasbara that simply doesn't work. And this Hasbara is not only education. We'll be talking about that. We all know that we have to educate Jewish young people, and not only young people, and non-Jewish young people. But Hasbara is a different thing. It's propaganda. It's a counter-propaganda, and it doesn't propaganda. From this point of view, doesn't have to be a lie, but it has to be done by young people, not probably us. We can do analysis, we can propose different things. We have to use Twitter, we have to use Twitch, we have to use Telegram, we have to use Facebook, we have to use all the possible means that we have to propose maybe YouTube, the short video where we inform people, but not very complicated discourses. And I'm talking about that because I deal with students, and the students are supposed to be the elite of the nation. And sometimes I see that this elite is not able to produce one correct sentence in any language, and they know hashtag discourse. So it's very important to take it into account and to work in this direction. Okay. Having a political discourse, having an educational discourse, having a propaganda discourse, and I would say, if I can allow myself saying, that we have to be more aggressive, because what I see in France all the time, we are all the time justifying ourselves as the lamb in the fable. You know, justifying doesn't serve to anything. It was a couple of weeks ago during the war, there was an announcement of the very important French Jewish agency saying that you are wrong to think that we are a apartheid state. You are wrong to accuse the Jews. I'm sorry. I mean, when you see that, no one cares. So this propaganda, this education doesn't have to be like we are used to do that. It has to be really aggressive. Aggressive not in the sense that we have to lie, or we have to show the fact that don't exist, but we just have to have communication agencies, and we don't have it in France. Nothing works very well. And these communication agencies do have to have specialists, young people that are formed to communicate, not like we do in academic, rooms, not like we do here, but in a more short and more efficient way. This is the only way to convey the anti-Semitism. It will not disappear, anti-Zionism will not disappear, but anyway, we can talk not to our enemies, but to those who don't know anything about us, who are indifferent to us, who don't have any prejudice. That exists. It's very hard to believe, but it exists. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you. Our next speaker is Jonathan Arfi. Yes. Arfi is Vice President of CRIF and Chairman of CRIF's Commission for International Affairs. He has been a member of the Executive Board of the CRIF for the last 14 years and has worked closely with former and current presidents of CRIF, Mr. Prasquier and Kuckelman and Khalifa. Thank you, Jonathan, for your expose. The floor is yours. You're muted. Jonathan, we cannot hear you. No. He doesn't seem to be. Oh, yes.
No, he's not.
Yes. No, not yet.
This microphone is not.
Maybe you can change the microphone in the settings of the system.
No, it's something in his place. It's not here.
He's not muted.
He's not muted.
muted.
He's not muted from our point of view.
If you understand.
Jonathan, it's something there because I see you're not muted from here, but we cannot hear you.
Perhaps you get logged on his phone or something. No, he's not.
Okay, let's do this. Let's maybe move on to the next speaker to see if it is a problem of in your place. And in the meanwhile, you check the technical things. If there's no problem with the next speaker, which is Mr. Anthony Housefather. Mr. Housefather was first elected as a member of parliament for Montreal on October 19, 2015. And till 2019, he was the chairman of the Standing Committee on Justice and Human Rights. Following his re-election in 2019, he was appointed to serve as a parliamentary secretary for the Ministry of Labour. Mr. Housefather, thank you very much. The floor is yours. Let's see if we can hear you. So
you can hear me, I'm sure.
Yes, yes. So Jonathan is...
Je comprends, je crois qu'il faut qu'il change son microphone. But in any case, hopefully we'll get back to him shortly. And it's a pleasure to be here with you. I was on a panel earlier today on online hate, and that's really what I've been working on. I was the co-founder of an international task force of parliamentarians related to online hate. And I've been working closely with Michal Kotler-Wunsch in Israel, Debbie Wasserman-Schultz and Ted Deutsch in the United States, and parliamentarians across the English-speaking world in the UK and Australia to find solutions for online hate. And we released our interim report yesterday. And what we found, of course, is that online hate is a form of disinformation. And one of the things that we need to recognize as we get into the question of dealing with anti-Semitism in political parties or movements is the fact that there are some people who are living in an alternative reality. And no matter how much we educate them, we're never going to convince them, no matter how accurate and how fair what we have to say is, because essentially they have a different worldview and a different world vision that social media has created for them. If you have QAnon conspiracy theorists in the United States that believe that Democrats and people in the media are operating a pizzeria below in Washington, DC, that is a pedophilia ring killing young children, you can easily have those same people in their worldview believe that Jews kill young children for matzah, as was the blood libel in the Middle Ages, and you're not going to convince them otherwise because they still believe their alternative worldview. If they believe the election in the United States was stolen, then there's nothing we can much say to confirm to them that Biden won by 10 million votes. They won't believe it. So I agree with what was said prior. We have to find those people who don't have a different worldview, but are just poorly educated. And the goal is to teach them. And so I want to come at this from a little bit of a different perspective, because I don't have the academic credentials of Dave or David on this issue. I haven't profoundly studied the issue of political parties or movements that are anti-Semitic, because in Canada, our political parties and movements aren't per se anti-Semitic, and therefore I wanted to deal more with a political perspective as an elected politician, somebody who's held elective office since I was 22 years old, as a councillor, as a mayor, and now as a member of parliament. So essentially the majority of my adult life, I've been an elected official. How we need to deal with political parties and political movements, how we need to deal, whether we're Jewish organizations such as the Board of Deputies in the UK or CIJA in Canada or the Anti-Defamation League, how we need to deal with our politicians to make sure that our political movements don't go and become anti-Semitic and don't verge off the mainstream like UK Labour did under Corbyn. And so I often have thought to myself, what would I have done were I a member of parliament in the UK as a Labour MP under Corbyn? Would I have done what Margaret Hodge did and stayed in the party and fought against Corbyn? Would I have eventually left, like Luciana Berger, and joined the Lib Dems and tried to run for a different party? It's hard to put yourself in the place of a Jewish member of parliament in a party that is changing on you. And you need to sort of figure out, how do you best deal with that to stop the party from changing on you to the extent you need to leave? Because in the end result, as Jews who want to fight anti-Semitism, as those of us who support Israel, and not only Israel's right to exist as a vibrant democracy, but Israel's right to be equal amongst the nations of the world, we need to understand how we retain a bipartisan consensus against anti-Semitism and in favor of Israel within the mainstream political parties in every country. And in that case, we need to have a proper strategy. So we need to look at whether or not a party's leader and a party's policies are anti-Semitic before we judge them as anti-Semitic. We too often in the Jewish community will seize on one or two people within a political party and then accuse the political party and the leader of anti-Semitism with no basis at all, because we don't like what some member of the party, some lone MP or some lone member of Congress has said. And let me look at, at the United States as an example. We thrive in North America because Democrats and Republicans in the United States on a bipartisan basis have had a consensus that the United States needs to support Israel and that anti-Semitism needs to be fought. And we need to encourage that. We as Jewish movements should not be making the case, for example, that the Democrats have suddenly become anti-Semitic and anti-Israel and Jews shouldn't vote for them. Yes, there are isolated voices in the Democratic Party that are gaining leverage in the Progressive Front. Ilhan Omar, for example, that uses anti-Semitic tropes to attack Jews and to attack Israel, the Benjamins, for example. But that doesn't mean that is the mainstream of the Democratic Party. That does not mean that that represents Nancy Pelosi or Chuck Schumer or Joe Biden. Or the many colleagues that I work with on this task force, like Debbie Wasserman Schultz or Ted Deutsch. You have multiple chairmen of committees in Congress that are Jewish Democrats. And the majority of the Jewish community in the United States, in the same way they historically used to vote for Labour in the UK, still votes for the Democrats in the United States. And so making the preposterous claim that the Democratic Party is anti-Semitic, that some have tried to do, undermines the place of those moderate voices in the Democratic Party. And the same is true, by the way, about the Republicans. Marjorie Taylor Greene, Matt Gaetz, the crazy things they say, the crazy conspiracy theories they believe in, that doesn't represent the mainstream of the Republican Party either. And we need to be very, very clear that we want to retain mainstream leadership in support of anti-Semitism and Israel. I come from it from the Canadian perspective. I come from the party on the left, the Liberal Party, which is center left. We have in Canadian politics some on the right that constantly attempt to say that the Liberal Party is not good for Jews. It's not based on anything in particular. In fact, almost all riding with Jewish, lots and lots of Jews, let's say 10% or more Jews, are represented by Liberal members of Parliament. We have vastly more Liberal Jewish members of Parliament than those of any other party. And our Liberal government has been more supportive of Israel at the United Nations than virtually any country in the world, and more than any previous government. Yet there are still those that seek to try to tell Jews, you shouldn't vote for the Liberals. And again, that's not good. In order for people like me to have credibility in my party, in order for people like me to be able to be a voice strongly pro-Israel, strongly against anti-Semitism in my party, Jewish organizations have to be very careful not to undermine our voice by turning the parties against us, by attacking the parties for the voice of one isolated member of the party. It's up to us within the party to be then able to speak to our colleagues and push back when they go too far. And if somebody goes too far, we can publicly say that this person has gone too far. No problem with that. But don't tie the one person to an entire party if the party's policies and the party's leader are not anti-Semitic. And I find that happening very, very often. For example, we have in Canada our far left party, the Green Party, that has a Black Jewish leader right now. She won the leadership against somebody who I consider to have made many anti-Semitic comments, is virulently anti-Israel. In fact, he attacked me and another member of Parliament a few years ago, saying we were more loyal to Israel than to Canada. And all of the party leaders pushed back and denounced him for that. And there are those that are now telling the Jewish community to leave the Green Party. Don't be part of the Green Party. It's too anti-Israel, too anti-Semitic. And this Jewish Black leader is under siege in the Green Party. And if we take the position that Jews should leave the Green Party, well, she will no longer be leader of the Green Party, and they will have an anti-Semitic leader. So the thing that we need to do as best as possible is to try to make sure that we as Jews in the diaspora can vote for political parties because all of them support condemning anti-Semitism and being in favor of Israel. And in order to do that, we need to support the people in all of the parties. I can easily, for political reasons, condemn other political parties that I don't think are as strong on these issues as mine. But I need to work with those members of those parties in our task force that are strong people who are on our side and empower them, as opposed to make them feel isolated in their party and condemn their existence within their party. And I feel fairly strongly about that. And I thought that was the message that I think is important to remember. Jewish organizations in Canada do an exemplary job, and I work with all of them, B'nai B'rith, Sija, Friends of Simon Wiesenthal, in terms of knowing how to approach political parties. The goal of the Jewish community, again, is not to be loudly, vocally in social media in condemnation. It's to have the ear of those in power in every political party and to convince them that we need to support Israel and we need to condemn anti-Semitism forcefully. We need to support the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, all of these things. And in order to have the ear, they have to be able to have the confidence to have those frank discussions within each political party. And so again, I don't have that European experience where there is virulent anti-Semitism coming from a leader like Jeremy Corbyn. I don't have the experience of a party that is sunk to the abyss where I might feel the need to leave. But while we have political parties that have not gone that far, I think it's so important to have all of our voices as part of those parties, to have the ability to influence those parties. And I guess from my perspective, I just wanted to make that point, that it is so important to have bipartisan consensus against anti-Semitism, in favor of IRA, against condemning Israel unilaterally and treating Israel differently than other nations. And in order to do that, we need to have allies in every party. And the idea that everyone should suddenly migrate to that one party, and in most cases, the arguments come that it's the party on the right, and may not reflect our values on other issues because they're strongly supportive of Israel, I don't think is the right way to go about things in terms of Jewish voices against anti-Semitism, at least in the diaspora. So wanted to bring that perspective. And again, I thank you for having me here.
Thank you, Anthony, for your words. Jonathan, let's see if we can hear you now. No, we can't hear.
Oh, wait, I heard something.
I heard something, maybe the volume.
Say it again, Jonathan. Say something.
It's something, it's going, maybe it's a volume here, I don't know. Not here, in his computer.
Yeah.
No, here is okay.
Now.
Keep talking.
He started the logo on his phone. That helps because.
But it looks like a bad contact.
Yeah, maybe the connection, maybe you have a connection there because we can hear something, but very low.
Korea doesn't have means to pay a good microphone.
Okay, let's.
Can you hear me now? Is it better?
Yes.
Okay. Perfect. Sorry for this technical problem. First of all, thank you very much for me. I'm very glad to be here with you today. I will try to say things complementary to what Jana Grinchman said about France. She was very detailed about the, I would say, landscape of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism in France, and focused a lot on the cultural battle inside the French civil society regarding these issues. I will more focus on I would say, the political strategy for Jewish organizations and for moderate political parties to tackle these radical elements in the political debate. So as Jana said, we have in France anti-Semitism coming different sources, and inside the political landscape, you find anti-Semitism in the extreme left and the extreme right. You have also a lot of other sources of anti-Semitism in the French civil society itself. For instance, very classical anti-Semitism coming from, I would say, old Christian elements. You have anti-Semitism, of course, coming from the Muslim part of the French population and all the Islamist narratives. You have anti-Semitism also from the Green Party and the Green and ecologist movements. But I will mainly focus on the issue of extreme right and extreme left now inside the political landscape, because they are the only ones who can have, I would say, a political influence in terms of elections. And just to give you an idea about the weight of each extreme right and extreme left, 4 years ago, Marine Le Pen gathered 35% of the votes at the second round of the presidential elections against Emmanuel Macron. And for the extreme left, Jean-Luc Mélenchon gathered a little bit less than 20% of the votes at the first round of this same presidential elections 4 years ago. So it gives you an idea that there are in France almost altogether about 40%, 45% of the French population which would be ready to vote for extremist parties from the extreme left and the extreme right. What have been the answer of the moderate political parties and of the Jewish institutions over the last, I would say, 30 or 40 years regarding the extreme right? It can be said in 2 words: sanitary cordon. It's in France we say we have to maintain a sanitary cordon against the extreme right, which means the strategy is to break any alliance they could build with other political parties. And until now, it has been quite successful inside the political landscape itself, because we have had not so many cases of traditional right leaders building alliances with the extreme right. In many other countries, you can find examples of, I would say, trans-right alliances. In France, we have been able until now to, I would say, to keep this sanitary cordon active against the extreme right. We have had some cases of people passing from the classical right, traditional right, to the extreme right, but they are very, very marginal. The problem of the sanitary cordon is that it enabled the extreme right to consider itself as being demonized in the French public debate. And the problem is that people do not accept demonization. And all the goal of the extreme right now in France is to seek de-demonization. They want to be considered as a regular political party. They want to be considered as a potentially governing party, and that they need alliances, and of course they need also to try to get a kind of kosher stamp, because they know that the issue of anti-Semitism is very central in the way, on a moral perspective, they will be considered by not only the French Jews, but the whole political leaders. And as a French Jewish institution, the CRIF has always been very clear that we have to maintain a very strict denunciation of the extreme right. We do not accept any contact with them. We do not accept in a way, the process of tribalization, banalization, validation of the National Front, now the Rassemblement National, because we know that, of course, even if they say that they are not targeting the Jews anymore, they will have, of course, very dangerous, they have very dangerous ideas for us. We can think about the Shrita, about circumcision. We can think about, of course, a general attitude towards foreigners, and that's something we all know. The thing regarding the extreme left is a little bit more complicated in a way, because it's not easy to make people accept a sanitary cordon against the extreme left. There is a huge tradition of alliances among all the left parties. And it's not so easy to get the Socialist Party, for instance, accept the idea not to be in alliance with the extreme left. We have had a case a few weeks ago at the regional elections. We had a regional election in the Paris region. And in that Paris region, the Socialist Party arrived behind the Green Party and at the same level that the France Insoumise, the extreme left. And they decided to make a coalition of all the left parties together. Usually, I would say this kind of left alliance was not very dangerous to the Jews, because for long, the Socialist Party was a strong man in the alliance, and the Communist or the France Insoumise or any other left party was very marginal and was not to have an influence on the political statements of the left. It's not the case anymore. The balance of forces inside the left has changed a lot, and now the extreme left is quite as strong as the traditional left. It means that now, if we have an alliance between all the left parties, it could be very, very, very dangerous. And the main issue for us is to make political leaders of the Socialist Party understand that it's not their own interest to build that alliances, because at the end of the day, they will be overwhelmed by the, but also the ideas of the extreme. Our second recommendation on a political landscape would be to make people understand that what is at stake is not only the status of the Jews in the French society. It's not only the issue of anti-Semitism and the threats against the Jewish people and against Israel. It's a threat towards the whole French, I would say, Republican values in the French society. And we have a kind of, I would say, implicit alliance with all the moderate parties to this. In fact, Jews have a debt in France towards the Republic, which gave us, emancipation 200 years ago, more than 200 years ago. And there is a kind of alliance, which is not explicit, with the political parties affiliated with these Republican values. And we are in a phase when, in a period of time, when they are quite weak compared to what they used to be in French history. And we feel that we have also to be involved to defend Republican values in the French society, because it's a way to defend our status by defending on our own allies in the French public debate. So that's what I wanted to say to you and to complete what Yana brilliantly said about the French situation.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Thank you for words. Finally, I could hear you and was worth it. The next speaker is Dominique Cardy. I don't see. Let me see, please. Thank you. Yes. Mr. Dominique Cardy is Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development in New Brunswick in Canada. Was elected in constituency of Fredericton, West Hungary on September 24th, 2018, and sworn in as a Minister of Education and Early Childhood in 2018. Thank you very much, Mr. Cardy, for being with us, and it will be a pleasure to listen to your words. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the chance to be here. And like others who've spoken, I regret that I'm not able to be in Israel in person, and look forward to being able to meet some of the folks in this panel and to be part of this excellent conference in the future once life goes back to something closer to normal. So I think this topic around anti-Semitism and political parties is important to me personally as a Canadian politician, in part because I spent many years of my life working in international democracy development and saw during the period when the internet was starting to take hold around the world how more in quotes Western ideas around anti-Semitism were spreading as well and alongside other much more positive ideas of liberal Western parliamentary democracy, respect for human rights, and so on. That the dark side was a similar globalization of anti-Semitic feelings into countries that had no traditional connection with the Jewish people, but those messages still resonated. And so when I moved home to Canada and got involved in politics, it was something that was definitely in my mind and has continued to be so, as we've seen over the last number of years, that in Canada this year, crimes against Jewish people represent one of the single largest group of hate crimes in our country, higher than against Muslims, against our First Nations communities, who rightly receiving a lot of attention right now for past and current injustices. But underneath, there's this thread of anti-Semitism that has continued to persist. And I would agree and disagree with a couple of the previous speakers. Absolutely, Canada is not yet, fortunately, experiencing an equivalent to Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party, or God forbid, the horrors that have to be dealt with in France with openly neo-fascist parties and those same movements spreading across Europe. However, those same groups on the left and right spread their message internationally. And I think this is where social media becomes something that we really have to pay attention to as a driver for anti-Semitism, and look at how we can confront that as well as in our face-to-face institutions through political parties, parliaments, and so on. So in the Canadian experience, we've had recently, like just the last day or so, Mr. Housefather mentioned the difficulties that our Green Party is having, where you have a Black Jewish woman who's leader of a party with a very small caucus, just 2 other MPs. And one of those MPs crossed the floor, leaving that party because she said on Twitter that forced evictions must end. I stand with Palestine and condemn the unthinkable airstrikes in Gaza, #end apartheid. This was a Green Party MP. That same party had also had amongst its very small caucus another member who was rejected as a candidate by Canada's New Democratic Party, which had been the official opposition and has traditionally been Canada's third party, centre-left party again. Had a strongly pro-Israel leader and a guy named Tom Mulcair. He refused to let a number of folks run who expressed openly anti-Semitic, openly anti-Semitic statements. That gentleman, who was one of them who was not allowed to run, is now a Green Party MP. So there was a clear issue there inside the Canadian left. And that's continued to be discussed, and I think that's being well addressed. Obviously, in the Canadian right, that we have a tradition as well, unfortunately, of far-right neo-fascist and fascist groups occasionally attempting to infiltrate mainstream politics, but generally with little success. Unfortunately, recently, inroads for anti-Semitism have been more broadly seen on the left than on the right. And I think partly because left-wing parties are in some cases less institutionally prepared for handling people who self-identify as being progressives or leftists, expressing opinions that are frankly racist or anti-Semitic. And that discomfort, I think, further expressed itself recently. I mentioned this Green Party MP, a young woman named Jenica Atwin, who happens to represent the constituency I live in, somewhat embarrassingly. Elected as a Green Party MP, this was seen as a big breakthrough for progressive politics. She then leaves the Green Party because she says that the Green Party is too pro-Israel, and is then somewhat inexplicably welcomed into the governing Liberal Party. And in Canada, this has generally been treated as being a question of party maneuvering and politics in the run-up to a likely election happening here probably later this summer. But the broader issues around anti-Semitism were discussed briefly. The MP in question walked back some of her criticisms, which made her departure from her previous party seem even odder. And everything sort of quietened down. So one of the themes I know for this panel was talking about what can we do about anti-Semitism in political parties. And I think that the adoption of the IRA is absolutely one of the things that can be a good, strong, solid start for legislatures and for political parties. So I was honored to introduce into the New Brunswick's legislature earlier this year the IRA, full definition, co-signed, co-introduced by my Liberal counterpart. So we had two parties working together on that, and it received unanimous adoption in the House. And that was excellent. But now we've got to follow it up. And we've got to follow it up by saying we are not going to tolerate expressions of anti-Semitism by party members. So I do have a slight disagreement with my fellow Canadian, Mr. Housefather, on this, that absolutely you can't judge any political party based on any individual member, but you can certainly choose not to accept anti-Semites into your caucus. And you can certainly choose, if any member of a party comes out and says anything that's anti-Semitic, to have a clear process of trying to deal with that, first through education, but then through clear consequences, up to and quickly including expulsion from a political party. Because as we are rightly decreasing our tolerance for racism in all of its other forms, it is unacceptable that we have a double standard when it comes to anti-Semitism. And I think, unfortunately, in Canada, that has crept up somewhat. Broader discussions around race and decolonization and so on, all very important in the context of Canada's treatment of our First Nations peoples. We are often in the process of exploring those areas of our past, ignoring, and in some cases, allowing the amplification of voices that are speaking up with strongly anti-Semitic messages, talking about the role of Jews in the suppression of First Nations communities, the residential school system that's received a lot of international attention, a Jewish influence there, despite the fact they were run by churches in nearly all cases. So this has been an ongoing issue in Canada, certainly not to the same degree that we have found in Europe, but at the same time, we clearly do have challenges to face. And I believe that the IRA strongly implanted, but then also acted upon, is the way to go. And unless parties act on it, it's toothless. And my work I did overseas with political parties, I always encouraged efforts against corruption by party leaders and others, saying, look, the only way people are going to believe that you've changed is if you take a stand. And if you take a stand against someone who's an ally of yours, that's going to be something that's seen seriously. And I think that message has got to apply to Canadian party leaders and any other leaders of democratic parties around the world. If there are no consequences for anti-Semitic actions, then that is sending a message in itself. And the longer those actions are tolerated, the more that we allow the poisonous echo chamber of the internet to become increasingly filled with anti-Semitic discussions, and the more that we allow an increasingly relativistic academic environment where we're encouraged to say that really we have to question everything, there's nothing really that's true or not true, into that sort of moralistic, amoral, relativistic world, it's very hard to push back against anti-Semitism unless we take a strong stand by saying this is not acceptable, this is not welcome. And on this, I think we need to return to some clear standards of what is right and wrong, lay them out clearly, but then take the stand and take the political heat. Because I think people in the end as well are actually looking for people who actually have the courage to stand up for their convictions. So slightly more depressing perspective from Canada, perhaps, but I think there's everything to work for. And we just cannot let this moment pass, because the other problem with fighting anti-Semitism is if you start talking about it before you see the clear symptoms, often it's seen as giving a place and a space for extremists and anti-Semites to come and start espousing their views and to use your efforts to talk about anti-Semitism as a way of amplifying anti-Semitism. So more conversations like this on tools for policymakers, I think, would be helpful and welcome. And I'm running over my time, so I'll close there. Looking forward to the conversations. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you very much. We will reach at the end of our session. According to the document I have in front of me, it's 4:15 when begins the coffee break. I see my watch and it's amazing. We did it. We did it in the time frame. Thank you very much for all the speakers here present and abroad. And obviously a lot to think about and a lot to analyze. And for us, for Israel, to see if we will be able to find, maybe never, but one way, general way to deal with these issues in modern politics around the globe. Thank you very much again for your presence.